I am going to be passing this off to Don Bayless from Flagstaff, who is going to make an introduction. But real quickly, I have to just say with Rob Davies, he's been an amazing resource for us in Utah, and it's just really exciting to have him here today. Rob has always been available. He went to a talk show years ago on our behalf to talk about climate. He's just been great. So with that, Don, I'll leave it to you for the introduction.
That's a terrific introduction, Bill. And I would just add that Dr. Davies is highly trained. He has degrees at the bachelor's, master's, and doctoral levels in physics. He has taught physics at 3 universities. He has a particular level of training in both atmospheric physics and surface physics. And he has a passion for making some of the difficult concepts of his subject, stuff like planetary boundaries, tipping points, leverage points, understandable to those of us who aren't climate scientists. So with Bill's introduction in those couple words, let me just say thank you to Dr. Davies, and we'll go forward.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, let me say, everybody, thank you very much for including me in your conference and for the invitation. And more than that, thank you so much for the work that you've been doing for quite a number of years now. As Bill said, I've got a long history with Citizens Climate Lobby. I've interacted with your members quite often over the years and given many presentations at the behest of CCL members and to CCL members. We're all doing our bit, and the work that you're doing is often thankless and very difficult, and I greatly, greatly appreciate it. And I'm so impressed with the single-mindedness and the dedication and the perseverance that CCL has exhibited. So thank you all. So Don, I changed our title just a little bit. It was the Climate 2020. I'm going to call it the Climate of 2020. And what I would like to do today is start off with a little exercise. And so I'm going to ask everybody, if you would, to just even close your eyes for a moment, take a breath, and I just want you to imagine for a moment. I want you to imagine living in a community that houses as much habitat, absorbs as much energy and as much rainwater as the landscape the city itself inhabits. I want you to imagine living in a city that is caring for all of the basic needs of all of its citizens, from food and water and housing, to also education and healthcare and political voice and vibrancy of occupation. I want you to imagine that in your city, you feed and clothe and entertain yourselves with gadgets that are produced without requiring inhuman conditions on people locally or on people globally. And I want you to imagine that you feed and clothe and entertain yourself with gadgets and products of all kinds without imposing catastrophic impacts on ecosystems locally or globally. I want you to imagine living in a community where there's no power lines, and yet there are no blackouts. Imagine living in a community where there are no buses or trucks or lawnmowers or school buses or vehicles of any kind spewing clouds of smoke anywhere. And I want you to imagine living in a community where you wake up and you turn on the news in a free and democratic society, and you never hear about race riots. You never hear about police brutality. You never, ever hear about someone dying of a treatable disease or going bankrupt because someone in their family got cancer. I'm not saying that you're living in a perfect world. There are plenty of problems and plenty of troubles. But it's a world much more vibrant and sustainable and just than the one we live in. Okay, you can all open your eyes now. And with that vision in mind, I want to assert with the utmost confidence that to the extent that technology and scientific knowledge is necessary to get to that world we just imagined, we already have it. What we don't have is a way to get there socially or culturally. And so the question, of course, is how do we get there? We can imagine this world that I just described, that is sustainable and just and vibrant. And that is our destination. That is our goal. And I think that is the goal of CCL as well. And I'm going to bring it back to your very focused goal in a moment. But let's keep this top level goal in mind. And the question of what that place looks like is largely answered, at least roughly. What isn't answered is how do we get there? How do we chart a course from where we are to where we want to be? And the large-scale answer of that, of course, is that we have got to transform our systems of food, of energy, of economy, and all kinds of subsystems underneath them. And in order to do that, we have got to evolve our culture. And this is the top level challenge that we're all fighting for. Now I'm going to start with that. And now let me take you down to the challenge that you're working on. And I know I don't have to spend much time on this. This is an extremely knowledgeable crowd on what I'm about to talk about, but let's just briefly review. If we want to keep our global temperature rise under 1.5 degrees Celsius, we've got a budget. That carbon budget is 340 gigatons as of the beginning of this year. And we're going to burn through that budget in less than a decade. If we do not want that to happen, we have got to chart a course of carbon emissions, which looks like this, starting in about 1990 at 20 gigatons globally per year to where we were last year at roughly 40 gigatons per year. We've got to peak. We've got to peak now, and we have got to decline to zero by mid-century. And I think we all know this. This is a rational decarbonization, a decoupling of our civilization from its carbon emissions. If we follow our current path, the next 10 years through 2030 will look something like this, which is not peaking and not declining. If every country who's pledged to Paris keeps to its pledges, this is what we will look like in the next 10 years, which is not declining, but still continuing to increase. This is roughly what we need to look like in the next 10 years. The low path on a minimum. Underneath that curve, if we add it all up, this is our carbon budget. If we don't peak this year, if we peak a little later, then we burn up more carbon to begin with, and we have to make it up on the decline. Now, what does that decline look like? We've got this golden rule for carbon that says, roughly speaking, we've got to cut our emissions in half every decade for the next several decades. And this decade, unquestionably, is the most critical any of us will ever live through. This next 10 years is the most critical any of us will ever live through. When we say we're going to burn up our budget in the next 10 years or so, that doesn't mean we have 10 years to, quote, fix climate change. We have no time. We have no time. We've got to be going now. We have to be declining now. What does it mean to get on a curve like this? It means globally, we've got to decline in our emissions about 7% annually. We've never done anything like that. Last year, we went up a couple of percent. But the situation is harder because when we look at who's consuming the energy and who's producing the emissions, it's not at all equally distributed. The top 10% of the emitters in the world emit approximately 50% of our carbon. If the top 10% of the world's emitters cut their emissions to the average European emission, just the average European emission, That would eliminate 1/3 of our emissions right off the bat. If just the top 10%, and many of us on this call fit in that category, reduced to just the average European emissions, it cuts our emissions by 1/3. The top 20% of the world consumes approximately 80% of its energy and emits approximately 80% of its carbon. Here in the United States, the top 1% of our emitters, that's about 3.5 million people, consume the same as 2,500 times the bottom 1% of the world, approximately 75 million people, 2,500 times. In other words, this bottom 1% of the world's emitters, it would require 188 billion of them to equal the emissions of the top 1% in our country. So clearly this is not equally distributed, and as we move forward in trying to figure out how to bring down our emissions, there are places that we can target. So for those of us in these high consuming nations, this really isn't a 7% decline per year, it's about a 15% decline per year that is required to meet our 1.5 degree carbon budget. My narrative here then is we have to bend the emissions now. We have to cut these emissions every decade. That's about a 15% per year decline for all of us. And this is applicable on any scale, from the community to the state to the national, from the business and the home all the way up to a national emissions. So how do we do that? Well, a few things that are agreed upon by just about everybody who studies this is that we need to electrify everything. We need to put a price on carbon. We need to keep the fossils in the ground. We need to fundamentally alter demand. Think again of those top 1% of US emitters. And we need to fundamentally alter our culture. Now, the CCL is focused very heavily on that second one, put a price on carbon. And I think many of you would argue, and I think with merit, because everything's connected, that putting a price on carbon helps with everything else on this list. And that's absolutely true. The challenge, however, as we go about putting a price on carbon and doing all these other things in there, is that all of this work happens in yet another context. And so I want to take just a moment to talk about that context. And then we're going to come back to a mindset that I think I use to help me continue in this work that many days seems just impossible. So the challenge, of course, is that we're trying to solve a very big problem. And CCL is trying to solve a critically important piece of that very big problem. But we're trying to do that within a much broader landscape. So here we are boxed in, and we want to kind of unbox ourselves. We want to knock down those walls. But if we're not careful, if we're not aware of the landscape that we inhabit, we can end up doing quite a bit of damage to other systems and ultimately to ourselves, if we're not clear on the context in which this work is happening. So let me just throw out a couple of more things. Clearly, stopping climate change is critically important to reaching that destination we imagined a little while ago of a sustainable and a just and a vibrant world for humanity. So here's a piece of information. In addition to the climate crisis, certainly connected to it, but also happening largely apart from it, is a dramatic impact on life's biosphere. In the last 40 years, humanity has wiped out approximately 60% of the wild creatures on this planet. That's the populations of the wild communities. And the rate of species loss has increased from 100 to perhaps 1,000 times over the background extinction loss. Now, this is what's happening in the biosphere. And the people who study these impacts tell us that only so far, about 15% of this impact is from climate change. Now, that's going to increase as climate change intensifies to no question. But another way to think about that is if we fixed climate change tomorrow, whatever that word fix means, if we halted it tomorrow, this problem of massive ecosystem impact and impending collapse is largely unaltered. This is happening through a process of hyper-extraction and hyper-consumption and hyper-pollution, through vast swaths of habitat destruction and over-harvesting, particularly in the oceans, largely separate from climate change. That's happening in the natural world. And of course, simultaneously, we're dealing with incredibly difficult problems socially. This is the context in which we're trying to do this work. We're doing this in a work in which 40 million people, more than at any other time in human history, are living under conditions of some form of slavery, of forced servitude. 70 million people have been forcibly displaced from their homes through conflicts and resource scarcity. 800 million people daily do not get enough daily calories to sustain normal human life. 2 billion people on the planet today are food insecure. They're not certain they're going to be able to get enough food this week. And 3 billion people live in some form of critical human deprivation, without access to drinking water, safe drinking water, basic health care, basic education. That's more people than were alive at the end of World War II. And we're living in a world in which the wealth of a few dozen people is equal to the wealth of the poorest 3.9, nearly 4 billion people on the planet. Here in the United States, 3 individuals control as much wealth and power as half the rest of the country. This massive inequity in the distribution of our resources and our power base. And I bring this up right now, both the context, the broader ecological context beyond climate change, and the broader social context beyond climate change, because right now, perhaps more than any time since I've been doing this work, with the COVID pandemic and the intensification of our racial injustices, our chickens coming home to roost, which has taken the form most recently of our focus on police brutality and racial injustice and Black Lives Matter. For all of those who've been paying attention, and for all of those who've been working on climate change, and not been convinced that social justice must be at the center of our response, I think have to be rethinking that position, because think of what's happened in our response to climate change in the 4 or 5 months since COVID and since the resurgence of the racial discussion in our nation, intense racial discussion, almost nothing. We can't get these big things done without all hands on deck, without all people involved, and all people are not involved because of the mass inequity of the power and wealth distributions in our society. And so hopefully this makes it clear that everything is connected. And similarly, when we take actions to address climate change, we've got to be aware of how those actions are affecting the broader ecological picture. A classic example here is low carbon energy of hydropower, which from a climate change only standpoint is very attractive. But of course, when you start to look at its impacts on natural systems, ecosystems, you find that there are huge prices that are paid. We exacerbate other problems, and similarly with social problems. So as we say that we need to put a price on carbon and keep the fossil fuels in the ground, of course, there are large social impacts to that, not the least of which happen to the communities that depend on those, the extraction and the processing of those fossil fuels right now for their economic livelihood. So I'm not saying we don't do it, but we have to do it in a way that is cognizant of the broader impacts, lest the dominoes come back around behind us and smack us in the head. Okay, So far, this is perhaps not the most uplifting talk you've ever sat through, and anyone who's listened to me before certainly wasn't expecting that. So how do we move forward when all of the problems seem so big and so immediate and so daunting? We need a mindset that allows us to continue to do this work. And so I want to just spend a few minutes talking about that, and then we'll open things up for discussion. Now, I'm certainly not an expert in this in the extent that it's something I have studied, but I can tell you it's something I've lived for the last 15 years. How do we get ourselves motivated and moving forward every day? And by the way, that's the fighting attitude you bring to the table, everybody. Shame on you if you were thinking something else. Understandable. The base level of mindset, of course, that we need is to recognize the situation we're in for what it is, and that is an emergency. And this is a critically important mindset to wake up with every day. And I'm going to use this term emergency in a way as a scientist, in a technically precise way. What is an emergency? An emergency is a situation that requires immediate actions to prevent catastrophic outcomes. Let me say that again. A situation that requires immediate action to prevent catastrophic outcomes. We have no more time to respond. The actions we take must be meaningful now to prevent catastrophic outcomes. And so if we start from this notion of a planetary emergency, a number of things shift in our minds. And there are three framings in particular that I want to identify. So first of all is this notion of what is radical versus what is rational. Now, radical precisely simply means big or disruptive. But oftentimes we take it to mean something bad, something pejorative, right? That's oftentimes the colloquial meaning we assign to it. And I think we need to rethink that and make sure we understand what radical really means right now. And let me start by talking about what's not radical. Knowing about a crisis and responding to it as a crisis is not radical. The people who do this, who know and respond to the crisis, are not radicals. And institutions that do this are not radical. What is radical, of course, is knowing and not responding. People who do know and don't respond, and institutions that know and don't respond. And so in the climate change world, the true radicals are those who understand the data, but resist genuine, meaningful response. In the broader picture of our existence here on this planet, this is radical. This is radical. Mass industrial pollution is radical. This is radical. This is rational. Rational. Last October, 7 million people around the world in 128 countries walking out on climate strike. Rational. I think it's important we understand what meaningful response is, and what defines radical and what defines rational. The second little piece of our mindset that I want to talk about is this notion of viable, and often we use the term politically viable, versus what is necessary. And going back to our planetary emergency mindset, what happens in an emergency is what is viable is no longer important. Our guiding star in an emergency is what is necessary. When you're in a house that's on fire, you don't worry about whether it's viable to get out. You know that it's necessary to get out. And whatever is necessary, you go about making viable. So for example, suppose I were to say to you that to solve whatever problem it is we're facing, we should set some new goals. and that banning the production and sale of all new automobiles is necessary. Now, I'm not saying that's true, but suppose for a moment, whatever problem it is we're trying to face, I deemed that banning new automobiles, the production and sale, was necessary. I suspect no one on this conference today would agree that that is politically viable. It's something that just can't be done. And yet, we did it. In December of 1941, Congress passed and the president signed a law prohibiting the production and sale of all new automobiles in the United States with the purpose of meeting the emergency. They said, Ford, GM, you're not producing new cars, you're producing tanks and airplanes and munitions, and jeeps and trucks, and everything we need to meet this national emergency that we face of World War II. What was politically unviable on December 6th, 1941, was done by the end of December 1941. Suppose I said that we needed to ground all the airline flights, responsible for huge amounts of emissions, by the way, right now, right this minute, and everyone who's on them has to get off and just find their own way home. Deal with it. No one on this call, on this conference today, would suspect that that was even remotely politically viable, and yet, as many of you know, we did it. On September 11th, 2001, to meet the emergency of what was unfolding across the nation at that time. And so now, as we shift and say, what are our goals? What is necessary to meet this planetary emergency? It is necessary that we move to 100% renewable energy. It is necessary that we move to largely plant-based diets. It is necessary that we introduce things like high-speed rail and a price on carbon. And it is necessary that we keep the fossils in the ground. And our task is to acknowledge what is necessary and to make what is necessary viable. That is our task. And not worry about the notion of politically unviable. We worry about what's necessary and go about making it viable. So that is something that arises from an emergency mindset. And that moves to the top level goal of creating a sustainable and a just and a vibrant place for humans to exist on this planet. And I want to take one moment to talk about those last two words, just and vibrant. I should say that there are many, many sustainable states for humanity. There are many sustainable food systems, economic systems, political systems. Most of them are not pleasant. Most of them involve huge amounts of human suffering. But we will reach a sustainable state, by definition, at some point. Most of the states we could reach that are sustainable are not desirable. We want to reach those states that are also just and vibrant for humans, and that requires planning. And it requires a mindset. The final framing that I want to talk about that emerges from a planetary emergency mindset is the notion of hope and despair versus resolve. Pardon me. So oftentimes I'm accused of offering no hope to my audiences, and I plead guilty as charged. I'm not here to offer hope, and I admit that every time I give a public talk. I am not here to offer you hope, but I'm also not here to offer you despair. It's the completely wrong framing for where we are. You don't hope that you get out of a burning house. You don't despair that you can't. You just get out or die trying. And so the framing, the alternate framing, of course, that we need is one often associated with, with this gentleman. Now, Churchill was a complicated figure, historically, morally, ethically, on many levels, there's no question. But of course, we all most know him for his leadership of the United Kingdom and indeed the civilized world in the crisis of World War II. And I want to take you back spring of 1940 The Germans had invaded Europe. They had walked over the armies in their way. They had seized most of France. The British had sent an expeditionary force to try to repel the Germans. 350,000 soldiers and all their equipment had been overrun by the Germans and pinned on a beachhead at Dunkirk and faced annihilation by this unstoppable German army. At the same time, the British government, headed by Neville Chamberlain, was collapsing. This is the government that since 1936 had followed a policy of what was called appeasement to the Nazis, giving them more and more of what they demanded or threatened to take militarily. Churchill, of course, in 1936 had warned that the era of consequences was now upon us. In 1936, he was outcast from his Conservative Party for the stance that he had taken. But now in 1940, with invasion of the United Kingdom imminent within days and defeat certain, Chamberlain resigns and they hand the whole mess to Churchill. And if ever there was, in a framework of hope and despair, a situation that was due utter despair, it was this one. There was no saving them. The Americans were not involved yet, and they couldn't get them involved. All of their military was trapped and about to be wiped out. They had no way to rescue their military from Dunkirk. And in fact, the Chamberlain government was talking about surrender to the Nazis. And this is the moment in which Churchill gets on the radio and gives this very famous speech, of course, we shall never surrender. And we shall fight them in the beaches, and we shall fight them on the landing grounds, and we shall fight them in the hills, and we will fight them in the streets, and we shall never surrender. And we shall never surrender. And we shall never surrender. And my apologies to Sir Winston for my impression. But think of those words and under the conditions in which they were uttered. And what you do not hear is a man in despair. What you hear is a man of utter, absolute, unequivocal resolve. He's asking himself, what's the next step? And of course, the next step was to get the British soldiers off the beaches. And to do that, Churchill mobilized thousands of private craft, pleasure craft, yachts, fishing vessels, to go get the soldiers. And over the course of 10 days, they did just that and evacuated 335,000 soldiers from Dunkirk, saved them and brought them back to the United Kingdom. The next step is to get the Americans involved, and they did that. First through supply lines, and next through actual military involvement. He never went to that place of despair because that was not the mindset. The framework was resolve, and in the framework of resolve, the answer is what's next. The question is what's next, and the answer is to do that. And so if you want hope, and of course I don't mean to dismiss the notion of hope. If you want hope, to quote the world's perhaps most famous climate activist at this point, Greta Thunberg, if you want hope, act. And then hope is everywhere. Hope doesn't breed action. Action breeds hope. And that, of course, is what CCL is doing and continues to do. I want to play for you a very short video clip. I know that over Zoom calls, sometimes the video is a little jumpy. I think I've got the audio set, and I'm trying to optimize it. It's just a couple of minutes long, this clip, so bear with it. And the hosts, by the way, if it's just unwatchable, let me know and we'll just stop it. So I'm going to start this. It comes from the movie Apollo 13. It's another situation, of course, in American pop culture in which the notion of hope and despair was replaced by a notion of resolve. I want to show you this and just give you a couple of background. So to remind you, in Apollo 13, the Apollo capsule is on its way to the moon. It's a command module and a lunar lander. And what has happened is they're on their way to the moon. There's been an explosion. The astronauts aren't quite sure what's happened. But their spaceship is dying. It's losing power, it's losing oxygen, it's losing fuel. And the engineers back in Houston are trying to figure out how to fix this. And this is a short clip from the film. Okay, let's give it a try here.
So you're telling me you can only give our guys 45 hours? That brings them to about there. Gentlemen, that's not acceptable. Gene, you gotta talk about power here. Whoa, whoa, guys, hang on.
Oops, I apologize. We're gonna try that one more time.
So you're telling me you can only give our guys 45 hours? That brings them to about there. Gentlemen, that's not acceptable. Gene, you gotta talk about power.
I want to pause it here for just a moment for us to all appreciate the demographic makeup of a room full of NASA engineers in 1970, which I find kind of comical. I dig the sideburns for sure. All right, apologies. We're going to try this one more time.
So you're telling me you 5 hours? That brings them to about there. Gentlemen, that's not acceptable. Gene, you gotta talk about power here. Whoa, whoa, guys, hang on.
Power is everything. Power is everything.
What do you mean?
Without it, they don't talk to us, they don't correct their trajectory, they don't turn the heat shield around. We gotta turn everything off. Now. They're not gonna make it to re-entry.
What do you mean, everything?
With everything on, the LEM draws 60 amps. At that rate, in 16 hours, the batteries are dead, not 45. And so's the crew. We gotta get them down to 12 amps.
12 amps? How many?
You can't run a vacuum cleaner on 12 amps, John. We gotta turn off. We have to turn off the radars, cabin heater, instrument displays, the guidance computer, the whole smack.
Whoa, guidance computer. What if they need to do another burn? Gene, they won't even know which way they're pointed.
The more time we talk down here, the more juice they waste up there. I've been looking at the data for the past hour.
That's the deal?
That's the deal.
That's the deal. We got to turn everything off. We're in an emergency. In 16 hours, they're going to be dead. We got to turn everything off. That's the deal.
Okay, John. And then we finish the burn, we'll power down the LEM. All right.
They're going to power down the LEM, the lunar module. They got to figure out how to do this. In their minds, it's not viable, but it's what's necessary. And they're going to take the next steps to figure out how to make what's necessary viable.
Now, in the meantime, we're going to have a frozen command module up there. In a couple days, we're going to have to power it up using nothing but the re-entry batteries.
We've been tried before.
Hell, we've never even simulated it before, Gene.
Well, we're going to have to figure it out.
Well, we're going to have to figure it out. And that's where we are. So CCL has a job to get a price on carbon. We're out of time. You got to figure it out. And I'm so glad you're the people working on it. So we need to be in a mindset of emergency that breeds the mindset of resolve. It's also important, I think, for us to have compassion for the people who are out there dealing with their regular lives, which is now COVID, and the people who maybe don't quite necessarily see what we see just yet, and hopefully approach these people with a level of compassion. We have to believe what we know. There's no short-circuiting this. We've got to stop the fossil emissions. We've got to keep them in the ground. That's got to happen now. Everything's connected. These actions affect everything else. We're working toward a shared goal that I think all of us in this world, and certainly in this nation, can agree upon: a sustainable and a just and a vibrant human presence. That's a base level that we can all agree on. We don't have to do everything, each of us, but we all have to do something. We have to pick something and make it our mission. And at CCL, that's what you all have done, is to make this pricing carbon a mission. Thank you. This is the power of community. We don't all have to do everything, but we all have to do something. We can also work from a position of inspiration. That sustainable and just and vibrant world is there for us to get to. We know what it needs to look like. We just have to figure out the path there. motivation is something that can lead us. When we have to do hard things, it's not just about sacrifice. Sometimes it's about achievement. And even though achievement can often be difficult and unpleasant and involve some pain, we still talk about it like achievement. Think of a mountain climber reaching the top of Everest. They don't really talk about the sacrifice. What they do is they talk about the amazing achievement. I like to think of this as approaching it as cathedral builders. We may not see the path to the top of the mountain, but we see the next step, just like the people who built these amazing structures of antiquity, from the pyramids to the Gothic cathedrals. The people who started them knew they wouldn't live to see them finished necessarily, but they took the next step anyway, with confidence that those who came after would continue the work. And so hopefully you can all wake up each morning and think of yourselves as a cathedral builder. Let's just think about these for a moment. Okay, this is where we're headed. We've all got our bit to do. If we're resolved to do our bit, I think we can make it. I don't know if we can make it. I know we can't if we're not resolved. So thank you all for your attention. Thank you all for inviting me to participate in your conference. Let me stop my screen share here. And I guess open it up for questions or comments. I'm also interested to hear where you guys are and what you're thinking. So thanks, Bill. Thanks, Don.
So the first question that's come in is, this individual saw millions of crying voices when the governor of California banned the production of gas cars by 2035. How do we change our culture? How do we change our broken culture? And that's the reference.
No, I don't know.
Gas cars.
I don't know, but I think part of it, it's such a great, I mean, you know, I'm a physicist, for God's sakes. But it's certainly a question that many of us are thinking about and wondering about. And I'm going to focus on a couple of words from that list I gave you. I think the first one is compassion. I think that a lot of the angst in our country, a lot of the division arises from a space of many people who are just mystified by the world in which we inhabit. And of course, the disruptions that are gaining strength and power, both social and ecological, take us to a place of dramatic unrest in ourselves. And just trying to recognize that that's true for people. And then when we try to take away something that maybe many people gain real comfort from, just a car enthusiast, you know, who likes to rebuild and restore old cars or whatever, something like that. You know, we can see where we're just making the statement that we're going to ban all gas automobiles, taking away that comfortable thing, maybe for lots of people who don't really see a place for them in the replacement. They don't feel like they have a money for a Tesla, right? And they still want their own car, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's part of the answer, is having compassion for that. But I'll even go one little bit further and say, how do we change the culture is not necessarily a question that all of us have to answer. There are people working on that. And I'll just say that, in fact, that's kind of how I spend most of my time. I spend most of my time trying to motivate the arts community and the humanities community to work on these issues. We do not need technical innovation nearly as much as we need cultural evolution. And we get that. This is what the arts and the humanities does for us. So I tell the story of climate change and of sustainable systems and of planetary boundaries to lots of audiences. I would much rather Steven Spielberg was telling this story. There are storytellers out there. And so I spend a lot of time, I actually teach a class at Utah State University for arts and humanities students about the Anthropocene. And my goal is to motivate them to tell these stories in ways that I would never think of. And it's the arts and humanities communities that really connect us, that really connect us to these issues, right? Think of a lecture, a lecture by a sociologist on the Holocaust versus watching Spielberg's movie about it, right? How these stories get told are critically important. And so for the people in the arts and humanities, I feel like that's a critically important role for them, is to be telling these stories in ways that connect us so that these changes that seem scary and hard all of a sudden seem exciting and fun. That's my best answer.
Okay. I'm going to string a couple together here. One goes, I love the analogies of Churchill and Apollo 13. It's a great way to grab people. Any other examples for us to consider? And then along those lines, it seemed in the space shuttle example that there was a truth teller that the others would listen to. Where do we find that effective truth teller?
Right. What a great, wow, this opens up such a can of worms. I'll try to do this succinctly. So why did that work in Apollo 13? You've got this engineer that says, I've been looking at the data for the last hour. That's the deal. And Gene Kranz, played by Ed Harris, who's the flight director, says, that's the deal. And the electrical engineer says, that's the deal. And he's standing in a room full of people who respect data. They respect science. They respect knowledge. And when they're presented with irrefutable knowledge, they accept it and say, okay, that's the baseline, now we move on. Of course, that's not the society we live in. An enormous fraction, a substantial fraction of our society, an enormous number of people, more and more live in a world utterly disconnected from genuine fact. And I have compassion for this crowd of people because it's not their fault. And I don't mean this to sound condescending at all, but it is a reality. 40% of this nation subscribes to all kinds of conspiracy theories, to some level, to some degree, et cetera. There are many examples. I don't think I need to support this with too much. I think we all live in that. We see that. And that is a condition that has been cultivated and manufactured with deliberation and with just sort of cold-hearted intensity for 30 years. We now have an active propaganda and disinformation system within our society that is hugely effective. And again, it's really good at sowing doubt about what we do know and planting seeds to make true things that we know are not true. The QAnon world, I'm certainly pointing fingers at Fox News, at right-wing radio, at the Alex Joneses and the Glenn Becks and the Sean Hannitys. I'm going to name names. These people are doing huge damage to our ability as a nation to accept a base level of knowledge and move forward. You know, when I used to, in my climate talks, when I talk about we need to get on a base level of knowledge, if I'm talking to a bunch of policymakers, let's say. And so here's the base level of knowledge, and then I go through what we know about climate change. And as an example, I say, look, 3 or 4 years ago, when there was a Zika outbreak in Miami, and they were talking about, and there were business leaders at the table, there were health professionals at the table, there were educators at the table, there were policy makers at the table. And they had to figure out what to do to contain the Zika outbreak. And what I said then was, but there was nobody at the table who said, you know, Zika's not a thing. Those people got kicked out. Or Zika's not transmitted by mosquitoes. Those people got kicked out. They started from a base level of knowledge. Zika is a virus. It's transmitted by mosquitoes. It's dangerous, particularly for unborn children. and we need to do something. And they made some tough choices, and they did that. They invoked quarantines for a while, and then they tried to compensate the businesses that were affected. They made tough choices. They went forward. But now, of course, I can't do that. Because what do we have in the COVID discussion? We've got people at the table that don't think it's a thing. And they're given a voice. And that has been manufactured, and we know how. So that's, of course, the difference between Apollo 13 and now. You didn't have people in the room who didn't respect the data. So part of this is to figure out how to go around such people. And I no longer try to convince people that they're wrong. I simply chart courses around them. We don't have time. But at the same time, we can try to have compassion for such people. So I'm quite certain I didn't help, but that's my perspective.
Rob, there are 14 more questions, and we're out of time.
Oh.
But I'm going to put one in there anyway and extend the conversation. There are two questions about carbon sequestration. One is, we actually have the tech to restore our climate by removing carbon from the atmosphere, so it's a statement rather than a question. Another one says, what do you think about the role that carbon sequestration can play? We actually have the tech to restore our climate by removing carbon from the atmosphere. That's probably...
So I'm not an expert at this, but I certainly read about it. I think I can say briefly that from the readings and the study I've done and the people I've talked to, I'm most optimistic about storing carbon in biological systems, so trees and in soil. And there's been a lot of work that shows that we can store a lot of carbon doing that. I'm less optimistic about the notions of capturing carbon from burning fossil fuels and liquefying it and pumping it underground. We don't have the technology to do that on any kind of scale. And if we put large resource into doing that, I feel like that's stealing resource from the things that we do know how to do right now. And so I'm fully willing to admit that I'm not an expert in carbon capture and sequestration, say on an industrial scale. On a biological scale, we know how to do that. And there are plans to do that. So I'm hugely supportive of that. But of course, we have to make it public policy to do so.
Hey, Rob.
Hey, Rob.
This is Bill. And this has been a total treat to hear. I mean, I say that. I was in tears a few times, came around in it. And, I really appreciate you sharing and offering this perspective. We do have to conclude this session. With these questions, is there a way, is it okay if they write you an email with questions, or is there a way they can respond to that?
Yes, if you guys want to post my email to the crowd, I'm happy to respond to emails.
And thanks so much, Rob. And you're welcome to stick around if you'd like, and so appreciate your perspective.
Thanks again to all of you. Bye now.